And on that note, we're going to turn to the next item of business, which is a statement from the First Minister on COVID-19. The First Minister will take questions at the end of her statement. I would encourage all members who wish to ask a question to press their request to speak buttons, and I call on Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. I will update Parliament on Cabinet's review of the current lockdown restrictions which took place earlier this morning. Let me confirm, though, at the outset that with one limited exception, I will not be announcing any immediate changes to the current lockdown restrictions. The core stay-at-home requirement will remain in place until at least the beginning of March, and possibly for a further period beyond that, although not for any longer than is absolutely necessary. I will, however, confirm that the phased and gradual return to school that I said we were hopeful about when I updated Parliament 2 weeks ago will go ahead as planned from Monday. I'll say more about that and also about the importance of carefully implementing and monitoring that change later. In addition, I'll give an assessment of the current state of the pandemic, and I will signal when and how we do hope to give an indication of the criteria for beginning our exit from lockdown and the order in which we will be aiming to do so when the time is right. Firstly, though, I'll briefly recap on today's statistics. The total number of positive cases yesterday was 773, which is 6% of all tests carried out, and means that the overall number of cases is now 193,148. 1,383 people are in hospital, which is 45 fewer than yesterday, and 100 people are in intensive care, which is 2 fewer than yesterday. I regret to report that in the past 24 hours, though, a further 49 deaths were registered of patients who first tested positive over the previous 28 days, and the total number of deaths under this daily measurement is now 6,764. And once again, my condolences go to everyone who has lost a loved one. Let me now turn to an update on the vaccination programme. As of 8:30 this morning, 1,288,004 people in Scotland had received their first dose of the vaccine. That's an increase of 32,814 since yesterday. And it means that we have now given a first dose of vaccine to 28% of the adult population in Scotland. We've also met our mid-February target to offer the first dose of vaccine to everyone over 70 and to everyone with an extreme clinical vulnerability. Let me say there will be some overlap between these groups, but in total that is groups 1 to 4 of the JCVI priority list. That is extremely good news. However, expressing it in the way I have just done actually understates the scale of the achievement. Vaccination hasn't simply been offered to everyone in these categories. Almost everyone in these groups has had the first dose of the vaccine. Uptake rates have been exceptional. So we've administered first doses to virtually all residents in older people's care homes and more than 90% of residents in all care homes. Virtually all of the over 80-year-olds living in the community have received the first dose, and so too have 94% of those in the 70 to 79-year-old age group. In addition, although this wasn't part of the mid-February target, we've also now vaccinated 58% of 65 to 69-year-olds, which is the JCVI priority group 5. Now, it's important to be clear that in any large-scale programme, there are bound to be some hiccups. So if you are watching and you are over 70, or if you have an extreme clinical vulnerability and you haven't yet heard about your vaccine, it may be that your letter has gone astray or that some other administrative problem has occurred. So please do get in touch with your GP or call the helpline, or as a last resort, email me. And the address for that is firstminister@gov.scot. Overall, though, the progress of the vaccination programme so far is outstanding, and I want to thank everyone planning and delivering the programme and also everyone who has come forward to be vaccinated. However, I would urge people to remember that even if you have now had the first dose of vaccine, you must still follow all of the lockdown rules. The protection from the first dose doesn't kick in for about 2 or 3 weeks, and even then, we don't yet know exactly what impact vaccination will have on the transmission of the virus. However, in the weeks ahead, we are very hopeful that vaccination will start to have a significant impact in reducing the number of people who die from COVID. In fact, we do think it is already having an effect in care homes where vaccines started being administered in the first half of December. At the end of December, more than a third of all COVID deaths, 34% to be precise, took place in care homes. However, in the most recent figures, that proportion had fallen to 18%. Now, as I have said before, we are in a race between the virus and the vaccine, and I think we do have much more reason to be hopeful now than we did just a few weeks ago that this is a race we can and we will ultimately win if we are prepared to stick with it. In the last few weeks, as the figures I've just reported show, we have been speeding up the vaccination programme, but at the same time, we have also been slowing down the virus. Lockdown has been working. In the first week of January, an average of more than 2,300 new cases every day were being recorded in Scotland. The most recent figure is 810. So that is a significant, and it has been a sustained fall. As a result of that, again, we can see this in the figures that we have been reporting in recent days, we're now seeing fewer COVID patients in hospital and fewer requiring intensive care treatment, although it's important to be very clear that our health service remains under very severe pressure. Test positivity has also declined significantly from around 11% at the start of January to around 6% now. So all of this, together with the progress on vaccination, is extremely good news. But of course, and as always, it has to be seen in context. Case numbers have been falling because we have been in lockdown. And even after 6 weeks of that lockdown, they have only just returned to the levels that were being recorded back in early December. In addition, we think we are now seeing some signs that cases are falling more slowly now than was the case a few weeks ago. And a key factor here is likely to be that the new, more infectious variant of the virus is accounting for an increasing proportion of all new cases. As of now, the new variant is responsible for more than 80% of all new cases being identified. And of course, we already know from our experience last autumn and again in December just how easily this virus can run away from us when there is already a high baseline of transmission within the community. All of that means that the situation we're in just now, while better and significantly improved, is still very fragile. I know that is frustrating, and I know it can seem counterintuitive. Over the last few weeks, the sacrifices everyone has continued to make have helped to bring about that good progress. All of the news has been very encouraging. However, our room for manoeuvre still remains limited. Even a slight easing of restrictions now could cause cases to start rising quite rapidly again. And even if the older and more vulnerable people in the population have additional protection from the vaccine, we know that more virus circulating in the community would still put huge pressure on the National Health Service. It would also cause many more people to fall ill, and that includes younger people who we know can be vulnerable to what is called long COVID. And in addition, and this actually is perhaps the key point, we know that when community transmission is high and rising, the risk of the virus mutating and new variants emerging is at its most acute. So all of these reasons mean that, notwithstanding the good progress we have made, for a period yet, we continue to require to be extremely cautious. We need to continue to work hard to drive infection rates down as low as we can and then keep them low. Of course, all of that said, we know that we cannot continue in lockdown indefinitely, so we do need to balance all of the different factors and plan a gradual phased return to as much normality as possible, as quickly as possible. And that is what the government is now very much focused on doing. But as we do so, there are 2 points that it is important for me to stress. Firstly, we must be driven much more by data than by dates. I know this is difficult given how desperate all of us are to get back to something closer to normality. But if we open up too quickly to meet arbitrary dates, we do risk setting our progress back. Indeed, because of the new, more infectious variant, our exit from lockdown is likely to be even more cautious than it was last summer. And secondly, probably for a while yet, 100% normality is unlikely to be possible. So in a world where we can't do everything immediately, we will need to decide what matters most to us. And that's why you will hear me and other ministers talk increasingly about trade-offs. And I'll offer 2 immediate examples to help illustrate that. As I'll come on to discuss shortly, we are very deliberately choosing to use the very limited headroom we have right now to get at least some children back to school, because children's education and well-being is such an overriding priority. But being able to get children back to education may mean the rest of us living with some other restrictions for longer. And that's a trade-off we need to be willing to make at this stage. And also, if we want to return as much normality as we can to life within Scotland, the need to live for a longer period with significant restrictions on our ability to travel overseas is likely to be inescapable. So what matters most is a question we will have to ask ourselves often in the weeks ahead. And it will be important for me and for the government to be very upfront about the choices we face. Now, I'm talking today in general terms, but I can confirm that the Scottish Government is currently preparing a revised strategic framework which will set out in much more detail when and how we might gradually emerge from this lockdown. We hope to publish this new framework next week, probably at this time next week, following discussions with the other parties in Parliament and also with business organisations, trade unions, third sector bodies and others. It will aim to set out how we will use and balance all the tools at our disposal, restrictions and advice, vaccination, test and protect and travel restrictions to restore on a phased basis greater normality to our everyday lives. It will set out as far as possible the conditions that we think need to be met in terms of the data for us to start lifting restrictions, and it will detail the broad order of priority for reopening, including what a return to a geographic levels approach might look like in due course. Again, though, I would emphasise that if we want to keep moving in the right direction and avoid setbacks, caution will be necessary, which is why the framework will also try to be clear about what we don't think will be possible for a while longer. So to give just one example of that, we are very likely to advise against booking Easter holidays, either overseas or within Scotland, as it is highly unlikely that we will have been able to fully open hotels or self-catering accommodation by then. However, for the summer, while it is still highly unlikely that overseas holidays will be possible or advisable, staycations might be, but this will depend on the data nearer the time. However, given the risk posed by new variants of this virus, it is really hard for me to overstate the necessity of being careful, cautious and gradual as we exit this lockdown if we want to avoid another lockdown later this year. And that means, for now, all of us continuing to abide by the stay-at-home requirement. Indeed, doing that for a further period is essential to permit the headroom necessary for the change I am about to confirm. In terms of the order in which we do exit lockdown, the Government has always made clear that education should be the top priority. I announced 2 weeks ago our preliminary decision that preschool children, pupils in primaries 1, 2 and 3, and a limited number of senior phase students who need access to school for essential practical work would return from Monday, 22nd of February. I also said that from the same date, we hope to enable a limited increase in the provision for vulnerable children, specifically those with the most significant additional support needs, where schools believe that this is essential. So I'm pleased to confirm today that, in keeping with the advice of our expert group, this first phase of the reopening of schools will go ahead as planned on Monday. Now, we will need to monitor the impact of this change very carefully before taking any further decisions. However, I hope we will be able to set out the second phase of school reopening in 2 weeks' time. I want to be clear, though, to give particularly parents as much clarity as possible at this stage, that the need to properly assess the impact of this limited reopening means that we think it unlikely at this stage that there will be any further return to school before the 15th of March. Now, as we consider these issues, we are, of course, doing everything we can to ensure that schools are as safe as possible for children and for the education workforce. As senior phase pupils, teachers and school staff start to return, we will be making at-home lateral flow tests available to them twice a week as part of a wider package of in-school mitigations. Comprehensive testing guidance has now been issued to schools and local authorities, and as of yesterday, more than 2,200 schools had received deliveries of test kits. We're also working with Young Scot to provide online information and support for senior phase pupils who want to take part in the testing programme. In addition, senior secondary pupils will be required to observe 2 metres physical distancing while in school and on school transport in the period immediately after the return. And we are also publishing today updated school safety guidance developed with the Education Recovery Group. This sets out a range of additional safety mitigations, and to help implement them, we will be providing local authorities and schools with an additional £40 million as part of a wider £100 million package to accelerate school recovery, and the Finance Secretary will confirm details of that investment later this afternoon. Now, the final point I want to make about schools before setting out a more general message about the phased reopening is that the National Qualifications 2021 group will soon publish further details on how qualifications will be awarded this year in a way that fairly reflects pupils' experience of remote learning. We've also decided that all teachers and lecturers involved in awarding national qualifications this year will receive a one-off payment of £400. This will be paid to part-time teachers on a pro rata basis, and 2 days will be set aside for teachers to work on assessments this year. Further details concerning the payment and these assessment support days will be provided shortly. Now, the steps that I have set out just now are clearly of great importance. But there is a more general and overriding message that I need to set out and emphasise today. The success of this limited reopening and the prospect of getting, we hope, more pupils back into school later in March very much depends on all of us continuing to abide by the wider restrictions. The evidence suggests that the key risk in reopening schools isn't transmission of the virus within schools. Instead, the risk comes from the increased contact that the reopening sparks amongst the wider adult population. The risk is that schools going back might lead to parents socialising more at the school gates, for example, or returning to the workplace rather than working from home. And so, although I do know how difficult this is, I am asking parents and employers to make sure that this doesn't happen. If you are an employer, please understand that employees who were working from home while their children were being homeschooled should still be working from home next week, even if their children are back at school. It is, of course, a legal obligation for all employers to support employees to work from home as far as is possible. In addition, if you are a parent whose children will soon be going back to primary school, I can only imagine what a relief that will be, but please don't use it as an opportunity to meet up with other parents or friends. The hard but really inescapable fact is this: if the return to school leads to more contacts between adults over the next few weeks, transmission of the virus will quickly rise again. That will then jeopardise our ability to sustain even this limited return, and it will make it much less likely that we can get more pupils back soon. It would also set back our progress more generally. So for now, and I really cannot emphasise this point strongly enough, please treat Monday's important milestone as a return to education for children only, and not as a return to greater normality for the rest of us. If we all do that, then I am hopeful that this return to school will be consistent with a continued progress in suppressing the virus. And if that does prove to be the case, I am optimistic that we will then soon be able to set out the next phase in the journey back to school for more young people. And while I can't set out an indicative date for that today, I do hope to be in a position to do so in 2 weeks' time. Now, as I said earlier, between now and the next review date in 2 weeks, we will publish the new strategic framework, plotting a gradual route back to greater normality, we hope, for all of us. It will continue to prioritise education, followed by greater family contact and the phased reopening of the economy, probably with non-essential retail starting to open first. And it will be clear on the trade-offs, not least continued travel restrictions, that will be necessary to make more normality within our own borders possible. But for now, the most important priority, if any of this is to be attainable in the weeks ahead, is to continue to firmly suppress the virus, and that means sticking to the current lockdown rules. I know that by acknowledging how hard these rules are, I don't make them any easier for anybody. I desperately wish that I could be firmer now about exactly when and how we will exit lockdown in the weeks ahead, but I am acutely aware that moving too quickly or getting this balance wrong will cause cases to rise again. And that would mean more people ill and in hospital, more pressure on the NHS, and the prospect of more, not fewer, restrictions as we have to start all over again in getting the virus back under control. The fact is that a cautious approach, however frustrating it is for all of us, will be more successful and it will be more sustainable. So please continue to stick to the letter and the spirit of the rules. Stay at home except for essential purposes. Do not meet people from other households indoors. Follow the facts advice when you are out. Work from home whenever you can. If you're an employer, support your employees to work from home. Because by doing all of this, especially as children start to go back to school, we will continue to protect each other, our communities and the NHS. And it will allow us, we hope, to keep the virus under control while we vaccinate more and more people and make our way slowly but surely and steadily to better and brighter days ahead. So please, I would urge everyone to continue to stick with it and stick together. Stay at home, protect the NHS and save lives.
Thank you very much, First Minister. The First Minister will now take questions. Ruth Davidson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I thank the First Minister for advance notice of her statement. We've come to this chamber on a number of occasions calling for the vaccine rollout pace to pick up, and we are delighted that it has happened. Scotland and the UK are now leading the whole of Europe and much of the rest of the world in delivering the vaccine as quickly and efficiently as possible. Frontline health staff, volunteers, retired returners and our armed forces deserve the highest praise for all of their heroic efforts. And while the road ahead will be rocky with vaccine supplies everywhere facing hold-ups, the light at the end of the tunnel is getting brighter. Our schools are seeing a similar ray of light with confirmation today that they can start to reopen again safely in the near future. We have called for a schools catch-up plan to be published as soon as possible, built around a national tutoring service to stop the attainment gap growing, and we hope that the SNP will take that proposal on board. But to get us closer to normality, we need to get all key workers vaccinated as soon as possible. The details of Phase 2 have not yet been confirmed by the Scottish Government, but it would be helpful if we could begin to understand more of their thinking on this. Referring to the next phase, JCVI guidance states, vaccination of those at increased risk of exposure to SARS-CoV-2 due to their occupation could also be a priority in the next phase. This could include first responders, the military, those involved in the justice system, teachers, transport workers and public servants essential to the pandemic response. So can I ask if the First Minister has reached a decision yet on whether or not any of these or any other group of key workers are to be prioritised as part of the rollout of Phase 2 of the vaccination programme, and if not, when that decision will be made?
First Minister.
On vaccine, I want to record again, as I have done regularly in recent days, my thanks to everybody involved in the planning and delivery of the programme. At any time, it would be exceptional, but given the very severe weather that was encountered in Scotland last week, this progress has been beyond exceptional, and I will never be able to convey my appreciation to everybody involved in that sufficiently. And I think it's really important to point out that as well as now being in a position where we have such large numbers of people vaccinated, 28% of the adult population already, within the most vulnerable groups, it's our uptake rates that I think are most significant. And our uptake rates, I think, stand very favourable comparison to anything seen in any other part of the UK. So the protection that is being given to older people in care homes and to the oldest and most vulnerable in the community, I really hope will allow us to see a very significant reduction in the impact in the form of serious illness and death from this virus very soon. And as I said earlier on, I think we are already seeing that impact materialise in care homes. So we cannot underestimate at all just how important this is. The unknown question around, or at least one of the unknown questions, is how much impact vaccination will have on transmission. Does it stop us getting or passing on the virus? The Health Secretary and I had another discussion yesterday afternoon with AstraZeneca. The early data on this is encouraging and positive, certainly against the variants circulating in the UK right now. But we need more data in order to be absolutely sure about that. Second point on schools, I said that we will be making additional funding available to schools for a school recovery, to accelerate a school recovery programme, and both the Finance Secretary in terms of the money and the Education Secretary in terms of the detail will set out more shortly. Let me just re-emphasise the point I made here. If this gradual phased return to school is to be successful as we want it to be and lead to a more substantial return, the rest of us have to shoulder our responsibility to make sure it is limited at this stage to children going back to school and doesn't trigger a wider return to greater normality, because that would set us all back considerably. On the point about the next phase of the vaccination programme, briefly, Ruth Davidson says the Scottish Government hasn't set this out yet. I don't think any government across the UK has set out the detail of this yet, because we are all considering not just sort of provisional advice from the JCVI, but waiting to see whether the JCVI has more considered advice on the order that we would prioritise vaccination of the rest of the population after we've done everybody over 50 and everybody with underlying health conditions. We will set that out as quickly as possible, but all governments do take care to take and to follow the expert advice so that we get this as right as possible. So we'll focus on completing the JCVI priority groups right now, and over the course of the next few weeks we'll then give an indication of the order of priority of the rest of the population after that.
Thank you. Jackie Bailey to be followed by Alison Johnson.
Can I thank the First Minister for an advance copy of her statement, and also wish to pass on my condolences to those who have lost loved ones to COVID. Firstly, can I thank all those involved in delivering vaccinations? They have done a tremendous job and deserve our gratitude. The First Minister will be aware, though, that NHS England and NHS Wales have both said they will complete the vaccinations of the JCVI target list, that's all those over 50, and the clinically vulnerable, by the end of April. But here in Scotland, we won't be completed until the end of May. Can she explain why there is a month difference, and whether she will commit to completing those vaccinations by the end of April too? Secondly, the First Minister will be aware of the concerns about, if John Swinney would care to stop muttering, Presiding Officer, I might be able to progress with my question. Secondly, the First Minister will be aware of the concerns about supply, resulting in the partial closure of vaccine centres such as Ravenscraig, which is down to weekends only, Port Glasgow and Greenock, down from 7 days to 2 days a week, and reduced hours reported in Paisley and Renfrew. So can I ask the First Minister, when will the supply issues be resolved? Will the Government be able to ramp up vaccinations again so we can catch up on the backlog? And can she guarantee that everyone due their second dose of the vaccine will get it within the 12-week time frame?
First Minister.
On that last point, firstly, yes, and that is part of the reason why we have indicated a slight slowdown in the pace of vaccination over the next couple of weeks, but I'll come on to that in more detail. In terms of the vaccination of the remainder of the JCVI priority groups, we're all working to pretty much the same timetable. We've actually said early May. I think I've said that on repeated occasions. And we've been a little bit cautious around that because of the continued uncertainties around supply. But given the pace we have set, where for the last week or so, slightly longer than that, Scotland has been recording a daily vaccination rate which is not just the fastest in the UK, but has actually been the fastest in the whole of Europe. So I think that success gives me great confidence, although we monitor this literally on a daily basis, that if we have the supplies that we need to have, we will be able to vaccinate quickly and not just hopefully meet those targets, but actually be in a position where I would hope we could even exceed those targets. Now, coming on to supply, Jackie Bailey asked me if I'm aware of the concerns about supply. It's actually me and the Health Secretary who have alerted people over the last few days to the concerns about supply, so that we're being really transparent about the issues we are grappling with. Let me just set out briefly what they are. We're dealing with three factors that all come together. Firstly, and this is really good news, we have vaccinated more than 75,000 extra people compared to the deployment plan that we published a few weeks ago. That's because the uptake rates have been so high. So we've actually vaccinated at this stage more people than we thought we would have done. That's point one. Point two is that Pfizer have not reduced the overall number of doses that we will get, but rephased the delivery of those. So we know over the next couple of weeks, we are getting slightly less in supply than we thought originally we would be getting. And thirdly, which I've already alluded to, we are at that stage of the programme now where we have to start keeping back some doses to start vaccinating people with second doses. So that combination of factors mean that we think for a couple of weeks, instead of doing the 60,000 a day that we were doing over the course of last week, we'll be doing more in the region of 30,000. That means some vaccination centres, they've not closed, but they're going from 7 days a week to 5 days just to manage that reduction. And then as soon as the supplies start coming through, which is the bit we are just not in control of because we don't manufacture the vaccine. As soon as the supplies start to come through, that ramps up again and we'll be hitting the pace that we were hitting last week, which, just to remind everybody, was the fastest vaccination programme anywhere in the whole of Europe. So there are big challenges here, and what we are trying to do is be open about those challenges while making sure that we're vaccinating people as quickly as possible. But the people out across the country who've been delivering this deserve our grateful thanks because they've been doing an absolutely fabulous job, and it's to their credit that I can say for the third time in this answer, the fastest programme in the whole of Europe.
Alison Johnson to be followed by Willie Rennie.
Thank you. I'd like to extend my thanks to all involved in delivering the vaccination programme in Scotland. The rollout of regular testing for school staff and senior pupils, as proposed in a Green motion agreed by Parliament last year, is very welcome. But as we advance through the first phase of priority vaccinations, the Scottish Government needs to be making decisions about the next phase. Now, given the First Minister has said that getting all children back to school is her top priority, and notwithstanding, she told Ms Davidson that the JCVI will decide, but given that it's the First Minister's top priority, can she confirm whether teachers and all school staff will be prioritised? And can the First Minister outline what else is being done to ensure schools are as safe as possible? For example, will funds be made available to improve ventilation in classrooms, a measure that has been shown to reduce transmission? Thank you.
Thank you, First Minister.
Well, firstly, any teacher or member of the education workforce who is in one of the initial priority groups will be getting vaccinated right now. And the reason that's important is because of what we know about this vaccine. We don't yet know that it reduces transmission, but we do know that it reduces illness and death. It is vaccinating most quickly those that are most clinically at risk that has been the priority. And that will include teachers or anybody in any profession if they are either because of age or because of clinical vulnerability in one of those groups. After that, we do need to make sure we are taking account of all of the clinical and expert advice we get. Now, just Alison Johnson, I'm sure she didn't mean to sort of dismiss the role of the JCVI here, but just to give people an understanding here, I think in other parts of the UK, certainly in England, the government is statutorily bound to follow the JCVI. That's not the case here, but never in the lifetime of this Parliament has the government on advice around immunisation and vaccination gone against the advice of the JCVI. It is extremely weighty, and therefore it would be wrong for us not to pay attention to or to give due time for the JCVI to give any advice that they wanted to give. So as we are going through the rest of the current priority list, that consideration is underway and we will set that out as quickly as possible. And it may be, I can't say this for sure right now, but it may be that occupations have more of a priority regardless of clinical risk in this next phase, given that the first phase has focused so much on clinical vulnerability. In terms of wider mitigations in schools, testing, very important. It's the availability now of lateral flow devices that are allowing us to do this. The guidance that I talked about today, in addition to 2 metres distancing for senior phase pupils, sets out some of the other steps that will be in place. And as I said in my opening statement, and the Finance Secretary will talk more about this in her statement later this afternoon, we're making significant additional funding available to local councils and schools. So if that does require changes to ventilation, for example, in individual schools, we're making the money available to do exactly that. Let me be very clear here. We want children back to school, but we will not compromise the safety of children or those who work in our schools.
Willie Rennie to be followed by Shona Robertson.
The statement is silent on care home visiting, even though when we discussed it in the Chamber last week, the First Minister indicated it could be allowed soon. Conditions are increasingly safe. Almost all residents were vaccinated weeks ago. The vaccine has been found to be even as effective in real life as in clinical trials. And the First Minister herself, in her statement today, highlights the reducing impact of the virus on care homes. The toll on separation of families and their loved ones is heavy and grows every single day. So when will families be allowed to get together? When will care home visiting start?
So, as I've said before, this is of the utmost importance. When Willie Rennie said, just as a statement there, conditions are increasingly safe. That is a lot more glib than I would ever be, certainly on the basis of the advice that I have access to. I don't think we can afford to make assumptions about the safety of the most vulnerable people and in the most vulnerable of settings. We think that with vaccination and with other mitigations, they can be a lot safer, but we still need to be cautious. Now, what I outlined in my statement today, which I will go into more detail about when we publish the strategic framework next week, I said we will set out the order of priority for reopening, with education top of that priority. I can't remember the exact phrase I used, I talked about increased family contact as the next priority, and very much part of that is care home visiting. Now, as I said last week, the Health Secretary is working on revised guidance right now. I think she's got a meeting with providers of care homes this week. Sometime tomorrow, she's telling me, in order to try to finalise that guidance. So we do hope, and I hope that if not before next Tuesday, then I will be able to say more about it next Tuesday, that we will have some greater normality back, but we must continue to be cautious here. The toll that this virus took on our care homes, which will be subject to scrutiny, rightly and properly, for some time to come, was significant. We think we have substantially reduced that toll in this second wave. Vaccination is helping us do that more so, but we cannot throw caution to the wind when we're dealing with some of the most vulnerable people to this virus in our society.
Thank you. Shona Robertson, to be followed by Jamie Green.
Thank you. We all want to see a safe return to nurseries and schools and understand the importance, not only for educational reasons, but for overall well-being. So I very much support the approach set out today. The First Minister will be aware of the various studies which have shown that the learning of those from more deprived communities has suffered disproportionately as a result of COVID-19. So in response, could you say a bit more about what actions the government is taking to ensure that these vulnerable groups receive the extra support that they not only need but deserve?
First Minister.
Well, this is one of the most important questions in the whole of the situation that we are grappling with right now. And as we did prior to the pandemic, we are targeting additional support for those from disadvantaged background to support pupils. And we've set this out in the Chamber before. We've supplied devices to support digital learning at home and provided support for homeschool link workers to maintain regular contact with children. We've also supported the delivery of summer learning and support programmes, including family support workers, provision of food and additional learning materials. We're also investing and have invested over the past number of years in the Scottish Attainment Challenge, and that also includes money that councils have been able to use to deal with the poverty-related impact of COVID. So these are important issues that will not go away as we start to hopefully come out of the COVID situation, but will require attention and investment for some time to come.
Jamie Green, to be followed by Annabel Ewing.
Thank you. The limited return of school pupils is welcome, but questions do remain. The current approach suggests that cohorts of pupils will return in 3-week blocks. Adding in Easter holidays, it could yet be some months before pupils are back in class, an entire term of classroom learning lost. Can I ask the First Minister if the new social distancing measures announced on school transport and on the school estate will be practically feasible to enforce and introduce, because many on the ground think they are not? And can the First Minister guarantee that every school seeing a return of pupils on Monday will have that comprehensive testing regime in place by Monday?
First Minister.
Can I just firstly caution against the assumption, and I'm not saying it's an unreasonable assumption based on what I've said, but caution against that assumption that it will be cohorts in 3-week blocks that then takes a long period of time. I certainly am not standing here today ruling that out, because I can't. But equally, if the data allows it, we will try to get children back to school much more quickly than that. So I know it's difficult to avoid sometimes, but we should maybe try to stop making those fixed assumptions. We will do everything we can to have the return to school happen as quickly as possible. While children are not physically in school, they are learning remotely, and we know that that has an impact not just on their education but on their wider well-being. But the provision of remote learning, I think, if not, I'm sure not every parent would agree with this, but certainly many of those who have contacted me say that it is significantly improved from school closures in the first lockdown, and we continue to work with councils and make provision for councils to continue to support that. Similarly, every reasonable step will be taken to make sure school buildings are as safe as possible for children as they return. And in that context, yes, I am assured that every school for the senior phase, where pupils are returning next week, have the testing provision in place. As I said in my statement, more than 2,000 schools have had test kits already delivered. There is guidance there about how they should be used and how the impact of that will be monitored. So that's an important step forward, and we continue to work with those across education to take whatever additional steps are necessary.
Thank you. Annabel Ewing, to be followed by Elaine Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Given the increased transmissibility of the new variants of the virus, can the First Minister confirm that in reviewing the strategic framework, the metrics which are used to determine what level any particular part of the country may fall within may indeed require to be adjusted? And is the First Minister in a position at this point to indicate what any such adjusted metric may in fact look like? Thank you.
First Minister.
That's an important question. Before I come on to that question, actually, the Deputy First Minister was just telling me when I sat down from answering the last question that there were some schools that had their test supplies disrupted last week because of the weather, but steps are underway to make sure they get those supplies as quickly as possible. That doesn't change the information I gave earlier on. On that point, we will, in the strategic framework next week, and we're obviously thinking very carefully about this, suggest a number of metrics that will guide the different phases of lifting lockdown, which I would anticipate initially being on, apart from the islands that are in a different position already, would be on a national basis. We will then hopefully at some point move back to a more regional basis where areas will be in different levels depending on the prevalence of the virus, and we will start to set out what metrics would guide that as well. One of the most difficult metrics for us to try to determine at the moment, and it may be that it takes a bit longer than next week to do that, is to be crude about it, what percentage of the population needs to be vaccinated in order to start easing restrictions. And one of the reasons that is very difficult right now is because we don't yet know exactly what impact the vaccine has on the transmission of the virus. So that is an area of uncertainty. We're spending a lot of time with clinical advisors trying to understand that and trying to see just how definitive we can be around that metric, but it may take a bit longer than next week to get to a settled point on that. But we are, on the other metrics, people will remember the metrics and the indicators used in the last version of the strategic framework that guided the levels decisions. We are looking to amend those to take much more account of the WHO advice on these matters, and that's what we will set out, amongst other things, in the document we publish next week.
Elaine Smith, followed by Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister in her statement invited people to email her, and I don't want to put anyone off doing that. However, I wrote to her at the start of the year about the closure of places of worship and explained the importance of communal worship for spiritual, social and psychological benefits, but I've received no response as yet. So can I now ask her, with schools beginning to return and Lent starting tomorrow, can she give some reassurance to Scotland's Christians that she will prioritise churches in her strategic framework so that they can be amongst the first places to reopen, hopefully in time to celebrate Easter?
First Minister.
We will try to get places of worship back to normality. Places of worship are not closed, but of course the ability to worship normally and freely is restricted, and I deeply regret that, as I know everybody does. So we want to get that back to normality as quickly as possible. Without preempting what we will set out in the strategic framework next week, I think you will see that there is a priority given to getting places of worship open again, given the importance we attach to that. So we will continue to try to do that as quickly as possible. And what I would say to people, and I know many people feel very strongly about this, and I do understand that, but nobody in the government, and that includes me, wants to have anywhere operating less than normally for any longer than is necessary. Now, with some settings, that is easier to bear for people than others. Schools, we know how difficult it is. Care homes, we know how difficult places of worship as well. So as we get the virus suppressed, as we continue to make progress with vaccination, that is what I mean when I say we are going to have to make choices about what matters most to us. Sometimes these will be difficult choices, but the more we can build a consensus about the things that really do matter, and I would include places of worship in that, then the more I think we can come out of this lockdown in a sensible and sustainable way and hopefully avoid the need for another one later in the year.
Kenneth Gibson, to be followed by Liz Smith. Hang on, Mr Gibson, I think your microphone is not on. Yeah, there we are.
Thank you. Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can the First Minister expand on how the phased reopening of schools that she outlined in her statement reflects the need to balance the harms associated with keeping children out of school and the latest clinical and scientific advice? And how will the Scottish Government continue to support childcare providers who have experienced financial pressure due to the pandemic and the restrictions placed upon them?
First Minister.
We have given financial support to childcare providers. We'll continue to look favourably at that as far as we can. We made some additional support available, I think, just last week or the week before to childminders, recognising the particular difficulties that they are facing. In terms of the balance that we're trying to strike here, it's not an easy balance. These judgments are often quite fine, but we do recognise the harm that has been done to young people of all ages, from being outside school, away from their friends, away from the normal experiences of growing up. So we want to introduce normality there as much as possible. But we do know, and we think school environments with the right mitigations in place are safe. And that's the reason I emphasised at this point in my earlier remarks, the risks around school opening. And these risks are real in terms of the impact they can have on wider community transmission don't come so much from transmission inside schools as from the contacts that go around school openings. So parents feeling that they're able to go back to the workplace or socialise more because their children are in school. That's what will make this unsustainable if we don't all make a concerted effort to make sure that doesn't happen. And that's why I'm going to keep repeating to parents and other adults out there, please, please do not take Monday's milestone in education as a return to normality, because if we do that, there is a real risk that we'll go backwards rather than continue to move forwards.
Liz Smith, to be followed by Emma Harper.
Thank you, First Minister. I have a constituent in Oxford Ardor who is currently working as an aerospace engineer with Bristow's in Nigeria, due back home on leave in March. Under rules in England, he would not need to quarantine when he flies home because Nigeria is not on the red list and aerospace engineers are exempt. In Scotland, however, he would face quarantine with the heavy costs involved and he wouldn't be exempt. So can I ask the First Minister how she will address this situation?
First Minister.
I'm happy to look at any individual case, but I am not going to stand... This is difficult for people, particularly people in the kind of situation that Liz Smith has outlined. But these rules are in place in Scotland for a reason, because the biggest risk we face, certainly one of the biggest risks we face in the next few months that would set us all back and put us back into lockdown, are new variants being imported into the country that circulate more quickly, that might be more severe, but also crucially, as we fear might be the case with the South African variant, beat the vaccine or at least reduce the efficacy of our vaccine. So we must be really vigilant and really stringent in trying to avoid that. Now, I wish that there was a common UK-wide position on this. I hope there will be in future, but I have a responsibility with my colleagues to make sure we are doing everything within our power to avoid importation of new variants of the virus to Scotland, and that is what we will continue to do. We will continue to be as flexible as we can be, both with exemptions for good reasons and with the consideration of individual cases that are perhaps unique circumstances. But the more exemptions we allow to this, the more individual circumstances we cater for, the leakier a system like this becomes, and the more chance there is that a few months from now we'll be back in lockdown because of a new variant that is beating the vaccine, circulating faster, and we need to get it back under control. And that's what we've got to do everything we can to guard against.
Emma Harper, to be followed by Daniel Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister has just responded about wider preparation for testing of senior students and teachers. Could the First Minister also outline any update for testing and vaccinating for police officers?
First Minister.
My answer is the same. I'm not. This answer is not varied depending on which occupational group I'm talking about. So police officers right now, if they have underlying health conditions, or if they are, which is perhaps less likely, in one of the older age cohorts, although ultimately that is everybody over 50, will be included in the initial JCVI priority list. After that, we have not yet come to final decisions about whether there will be an order of priority in the rest of the population or whether we just vaccinate the rest of the population as they come. We are waiting to see whether there is any more detailed expert advice, but we will take these decisions as soon as possible.
Daniel Johnson to be followed by Willie Coffey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Teachers have performed an outstanding job delivering learning via virtual means. But I know the First Minister will also agree with me that today's announcement is welcome because it should be the beginning of the end of these arrangements made necessary because of COVID. With this desire to get back to face-to-face learning, does she share my alarm and that of parents and students at James Gillespie's High School in my constituency that it's being proposed that blended learning be continued through next academic year for S6, not because of COVID or social distancing requirements, but because of a lack of physical space in their school buildings? It is being proposed that 40% of teaching will be provided online for S6 next year. Now, I don't expect the First Minister to be able to comment on the detail of this, but with the announcement today, can she confirm that blended learning should be limited to dealing with the pandemic and should not continue any longer than strictly necessary? And does she agree with me that virtual and blended learning cannot be allowed to become the new normal for any school students, let alone those in S6 at Gillespie's next year?
First Minister.
I think I would agree with a lot, if not all, of the sentiment in that question. I may not be able to go as far as the member would like on some of the detail because I cannot see that far into the future in terms of the control of this virus. Unfortunately, I wish I could. I certainly don't want to see blended learning become the new normal. As far as I'm concerned, it is something that is necessary right now because of COVID, and we should not have it in place any longer than is necessary. But we need to have it in place for as long as it is necessary to help with the suppression of the virus. But I think I have been very clear that it is the priority of the government to get children back to in-person, face-to-face learning on a full-time basis, just as we did last August, quite successfully for an extended period of time, as soon as possible. Now, what the phasing of that looks like beyond the 22nd of February, I hope I can give more of an indication of when I'm standing here 2 weeks from now, but I can't be definitive about that right now. But I certainly don't want to see blended learning being necessary for any longer than this virus absolutely necessitates.
Willie Coffey to be followed by Jamie Halker-Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I wonder, could I ask the First Minister if she can clarify when general patients in hospital who are potentially there medium to long term will get their vaccine?
First Minister. There was a story in some of the media about this yesterday. So this is down to clinical judgment. The general position, I don't have the vaccine green book in front of me, but I was reading the particular extract on this yesterday, so I'm talking from memory here to some extent, but the general position is that patients should be vaccinated before they're discharged from hospital. When exactly within their stay in hospital that happens will be down to clinical judgment. There will be some circumstances in which the clinical judgment is that while a patient is still in the acute phase of their illness, it would not make sense to vaccinate in case any side effects from the vaccination confuse the symptoms of their illness. So in those circumstances, the clinical judgment would be to wait until a person was better and closer to discharge. But the general position is that any patient in that circumstance should be vaccinated before they are discharged from hospital.
Thank you. Jamie Halker-Johnson to be followed by Christine Graham.
Thank you. I'm sure we're all aware of the impact of these restrictions on mental health, and people of all ages have been left isolated from friends and family and from their support groups. So can I ask the First Minister if any additional support has been provided during this lockdown after a recent study showed a rise in suicidal thoughts in young people?
First Minister.
We have provided additional support at various stages throughout the pandemic so far, but I know the Finance Secretary may have more to say in terms of further support for mental health later on this afternoon or in the course of the budget considerations over the next couple of weeks. We are all acutely aware of the impact on mental health, from the milder impact right through to very severe impact. And again, like so much of the implications of this pandemic, there will be a need to give due support to people for that for some time to come.
Christine Graham, to be followed by Mark Griffin.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I welcome the return to school of P1 to P3 across Scotland and in Midlothian South, Tweedale and Lauderdale, my constituency. But their composite classes are not uncommon, and a composite class, of course, is a maximum of 25 pupils. Will the First Minister, in a P3, P4 composite class, given that class limit, confirm that only P3 pupils can return while their P4 classmates remain at home, or will there be flexibility?
First Minister.
Well, where P3, P4 composite classes are in place, P3 children should be taught in school from Monday, and remote learning should continue for P4 children, except in exceptional circumstances. And this is all going to be confirmed today in guidance relating to the phased reopening of schools. I know that making these arrangements for P3, P4 composite classes will be really challenging, but we do encourage schools and local authorities to use sensible flexibility in how they deploy staff and deliver learning. Ultimately, though, we've got to consider this question in the context of the pandemic, and allowing exceptions for some P4 children routinely would increase the number of children in school, and that then would potentially start to send mixed messages about which children are returning to school and compromise the safe and sustainable phased reopening that we're seeking to achieve.
Thank you, Mark Griffin, to be followed by Tom Arthur.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Ravenscraig Sports Centre has capacity to vaccinate 2,000 people a day, but Port state it's only open at weekends due to a lack of demand. It has unused capacity to vaccinate the entire North Lanarkshire education workforce in just 3 days ahead of schools reopening, vaccinate retail workers or staff on other priority groups. How will the Scottish Government make sure vital capacity is not lying unused?
First Minister.
Anybody just needs to look at the performance of our vaccination teams over the last couple of weeks to know that we're not leaving capacity lying unused if we have the vaccine to vaccinate people. So the reason we can't do what Mark Griffin has just set out is for reasons beyond our control, because this is in the control of the vaccination, the pharmaceutical companies manufacturing the vaccine, is we don't have enough vaccine supply to do that while getting through the priority GCVI groups and starting second doses. This is the key constraint that we will face for the next couple of weeks is not in capacity, not in our ability to do this quickly, but simply in the number of vaccine doses that we have at our disposal. As soon as it ramps up, the operation ramps up again. So I'm trying and have been trying in recent days to set this out very clearly for people so that we understand, everybody understands the challenges that we're confronting here. One of the reasons the Health Secretary and I were speaking to AstraZeneca yesterday was to get as much clarity from them about their forward supply expectations so that we then factor that in. But right now, and again, the performance speaks for itself, the key constraining factor that we face right now is in supply. Now, we hope that that will not be something that constrains us for more than a couple of weeks and that supplies then start to improve again. That's certainly our expectation, but we can only go as fast as the total amount of doses that we have available to us.
Thank you. Apologies, it's not Mr Arthur next. Maurice Corrie, to be followed by Pauline McNeill.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Travel to and from Scotland for our Merchant Navy crews is vital for their continued essential work and employment contracts. Can the First Minister confirm that the Scottish Government will continue to comply with the arrangements currently in place as agreed between the United Kingdom Government, the British Chamber of Shipping and officers and crew unions? These arrangements cover quarantining procedures when they return on leave to the United Kingdom, often from extended tours of duty, particularly during the current COVID pandemic.
I, off the top of my head, know of no reason why we are changing those, but I want to just double check that there isn't anything that I am not immediately aware of, and I will confirm that with the member. But essential work and what he's just outlined there is, of course, included in that essential work category, is permitted. But the key message here we're trying to get across, and I appreciate people for very good reasons want to make the case for exemptions, but let's not lose sight of the fact that we should all be seeking to get the message across to people that unless travel is essential right now, don't travel. And the more we get that message across, the less worried we are about some of these exemptions for genuinely essential purposes. But if there is any reason that I'm not aware of that the position might be changing, I'll get back to the member, but I'm not aware of it at the moment.
And Pauline McNeill.
There is a huge disparity in the online teaching across schools. Some children have been taught by Teams and others have online access only, and some children are not adapting very well to this. I wonder if the First Minister thought there was a case for a more of a national approach to ensure that there's some basic uniformity in what children receive. And could the First Minister, when the time is safe, encourage more one-to-one tuition where that's possible? Because many children have struggled through this pandemic and going to need one-to-one tuition to get them back on track.
First Minister.
Look, these are always difficult balances to strike. If we had tried to impose national uniformity on this, I suspect, and I don't mean this critically, it's just a fact of life, I would have had lots of members saying surely schools know their young people best and we should allow schools greater flexibility. So schools do know their young people best, and I think it is really important to trust that professional judgment of teachers and how they provide this. But we know while children or some children are out of school, we need to continue on an ongoing basis to make sure that the remote learning offer is what it needs to be. eSchool, of course, has already got provision for tutoring and additional support, and that is really important. But all of this brings us back to a central point here. We want to get children back into school in person full-time as quickly as possible, and that means the rest of us for a little while longer all agreeing to live with these tough restrictions so that we can create the headroom in the fight against this virus to make that possible.
Thank you, and apologies to those members. Elaine Smith, point of order.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Could I make a point of order under our rules for amending the official record? Because just earlier in response to my question, the First Minister said, and I quote, "Places of worship are not closed." But the regulations say very clearly that they are closed for communal worship and private prayer, and they're only allowed to open for very small funerals and weddings. So I wonder if the First Minister could take the opportunity to correct the record as allowed by our rules, because many people will be confused by the earlier assertion.
Order, please.
And I
Order,
think,
please.
Presiding Officer, I think we all know that it is absolutely essential to be clear about these regulations that are in place just now. The importance of that can't be overemphasised. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms Smith. That's not a point of order, but it is a helpful point of correction, which I'm sure the First Minister will take. Well, it's a point that the member has made about the information, which I'm sure the First Minister will pay attention to. I'll give the First Minister a chance to respond now if she wishes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm sorry, I wouldn't normally do this, but it is a really important point for many people across the country. I think any careful listening to Elaine Smith's reading of the regulations and then looking at what I said would actually see there is no inconsistency. Places of worship are not closed, but they are only able to be open for very limited purposes. And it's because I know how difficult and distressing that is for many people that I am so intent on all of us trying to get into a better position as quickly as possible. So I wouldn't want anybody to think that there was any glibness about this or any inability to understand how serious the point it is. And I don't think it then does anybody any good for us to be quibbling over the precise wording, when in actual fact I think we both articulated the position correctly. We perhaps put the emphasis in different places.
Thank you very much, First Minister. On that note, apologies to the members that weren't able to call, and sorry also, I think there's some confusion to the members online about notifying me about their intention to speak. But we have to move on to the next item of business. There'll be a short pause while we do so.